April 1621. A volcanic island, less than 10 kilometers across, on the opposite side of the world from Europe. Dutch warships have been anchored in the bay for weeks. When they finally sail away, fewer than 1,000 people remain out of the 15,000 who had lived there. These are the Banda Islands, 10 specks of volcanic rock in the eastern Indonesian archipelago, 180 square kilometers in total, smaller than most modern cities. And they were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew, not the main source, not the best source, the only one. A single handful of those seeds, carried from Banda to a market in London, could multiply in value tens of thousands of times over, enough to buy a house, enough to buy a ship, enough that a man could stop working for the rest of his life, all of it, for the small glass jar sitting in your spice cabinet right now, the one you open twice a year, the one somebody is grating over an autumn coffee at this exact moment, without a single thought about where it came from. But the story of nutmeg does not start with a massacre. It starts with a lie that held for more than 1,000 years. The Banda Sea. Thousands of years before any European knew that these islands existed. Myristica fragrans is not an impressive tree. It grows to about 10 meters, sometimes 15. Dark, glossy, leathery leaves. Small, pale flowers that smell faintly of nothing in particular. If you walked past one in a forest, you would not stop. What matters is the fruit. It looks almost exactly like an apricot, pale yellow, slightly ridged, hanging heavy on the branch. And when it ripens, it does something that almost no other fruit on earth does. It splits open on its own, cleanly, down the middle. Inside is one of the strangest sights in the plant world. A dark brown seed, hard as a stone, wrapped in a lattice of brilliant crimson lace. The seed is nutmeg. The red lace is mace. One fruit, two spices, two completely different flavors from two completely different parts of the same object. And for centuries in the markets of Europe, they carried two completely different prices, sold by merchants who had no idea they came from the same tree. Now here is the part that changed history. This tree would not grow anywhere else, not for lack of trying. The Banda Islands sit on volcanic soil, saturated with minerals in a climate of relentless humidity, sheltered beneath a canopy of taller trees that filter the sun. The seeds themselves lose viability within weeks of leaving the fruit. Transplant them and they rot before they root. So for thousands of years, every single nutmeg that existed anywhere in the world came from 10 small islands that almost nobody could find, and the tree makes it harder still. Myristica fragrans is dioecious. That means individual trees are either male or female, and only the female trees produce fruit. The male trees produce pollen, and nothing else. Here is the problem. You cannot tell which is which until the tree flowers. And a nutmeg tree does not flower until it is somewhere between 6 and 8 years old. So a farmer plants 100 seedlings, waits the better part of a decade, and only then discovers how many of them are worth keeping. Roughly half will be male. Those years are simply gone. Every nutmeg tree standing on those islands represented years of labor placed as a bet on a plant that might turn out to be worthless. The people who lived there were not isolated, and this matters. The Bandanese were not a forgotten tribe waiting to be discovered. They were sailors, traders. They built large ocean-going boats called kora-kora, and they sailed them west through the Java Sea into the shipping lanes of Asia. They were not passive suppliers. They were a merchant republic, governed by councils of elders known as the Orang Kaya, the rich men, who negotiated prices, played buyers against each other, and refused to grant exclusive access to anyone. They understood exactly what they were sitting on. By the first centuries of the Common Era, nutmeg was moving north into China and west into India. Roman writers described a tree from the east that produced 2 different scents from a single fruit, although whether they truly meant nutmeg, we cannot be certain. What we do know is that by the time the spice reached the Mediterranean, it had passed through so many hands, across so many thousands of kilometers, that nobody at the end of the chain had the faintest idea where it had begun. And the men in the middle of that chain intended to keep it that way. The route ran like this. Bandanese traders carried nutmeg west to Java. Javanese and Malay merchants carried it to the ports of the Malay Peninsula. From there, Indian and Arab traders carried it across the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Overland caravans brought it to Alexandria, to Damascus, to Constantinople, and Venetian galleys carried it into Europe. 6 or 7 separate networks, each one taking its cut, each one, crucially, refusing to say where the last one had gotten it. The Arab merchants who dominated the middle of that route were the most disciplined about it. When Europeans asked where nutmeg came from, they were told stories. That it grew in a valley guarded by monsters, that it floated down a river out of paradise and was caught in nets, that it was harvested from nests built by enormous birds on cliffs no man could climb. These were not folk tales, they were commercial strategy, because as long as no European knew where the islands were, no European could sail there. And as long as no European could sail there, the price stayed exactly where the middlemen wanted it, and that price was extraordinary. In medieval Europe, nutmeg was not a cooking ingredient. It was closer to a financial instrument. It was recorded in wills. It was accepted as payment for debts. It was locked in cabinets. And in some households, guests were shown the nutmeg the way a family today might show a piece of jewelry. Venice built a substantial part of its wealth on this. The Venetian Republic sat at the exact point where the eastern caravan routes met European buyers, and it defended that position with fleets, treaties, and money. The spice trade did not simply pass through Venice. It funded the city. The palaces along the Grand Canal were paid for, in significant part, by substances that arrived in sacks weighing a few kilograms. To be clear about the scale, in 14th century England, records suggest that a pound of nutmeg could be exchanged for several head of cattle or for a small piece of land. A pound of seeds. Some estimates suggest that a quantity of nutmeg purchased in the Banda Islands could sell in London for something in the range of 60,000 times what was paid for it. Even if that figure is generous, and historians argue about it, the underlying reality is not in dispute. This was one of the most extreme price gradients in the history of trade. But why? Why would people pay a fortune for a seed? Part of the answer is flavor and status, and that is the boring part of the answer. The interesting part is the plague. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. Over the following years, it killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of the continent. And the medical understanding of the time held that disease traveled through corrupted air, bad smells, foul vapors, what physicians called miasma. The logic followed naturally. If bad air carries plague, then good air must repel it. And nutmeg was among the most powerfully aromatic substances that money could buy. So wealthy Europeans began wearing it. Ground nutmeg was sealed into small, perforated silver balls called pomanders, hung around the neck, held to the face in crowded streets. Physicians recommended it. Apothecaries could not keep it in stock. Prices, already absurd, went vertical. It was superstition. It was medieval pseudoscience of the most basic kind. And yet, there is a possibility that they were not entirely wrong, not for the reason they believed, for a completely different reason, one that nobody in the 14th century could possibly have understood. We will come back to that. For now, understand only this. By the year 1500, nutmeg was one of the most valuable substances on the planet, gram for gram. Europe was consumed by it, and Europe had absolutely no idea where it came from. That was about to change violently. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached India by sea. That single voyage broke a monopoly that had held for 1,000 years. The Arab and Venetian middlemen had controlled the spice route because the route ran overland, through territory they held. Now there was a way around it, entirely by water, controlled by whoever had the better ships. The Portuguese moved fast, and they moved with force. In 1511 they took Malacca, the great trading port on the Malay Peninsula, the clearinghouse where the spices of the eastern islands met the merchants of the west. And in Malacca, for the first time, Europeans found men who knew exactly where nutmeg came from. The following year, a small Portuguese expedition sailed east into waters no European had ever entered. And they found them. 10 islands, volcanic, steep, covered in a canopy of trees that grew nowhere else on Earth. The secret was over. But here is what the Portuguese discovered, and what every European power after them would discover in turn. Finding the islands was the easy part. The Bandanese had been trading for centuries. They were not overwhelmed by European arrival. They negotiated. They sold to the Portuguese, and then they sold to everyone else as well, because their entire commercial system was built on never letting a single buyer control them. The Portuguese wanted an exclusive contract. The Orankaya declined, politely and repeatedly for decades. Portugal never managed to build a permanent fort on Banda. They took what they could get, and they moved on. There is one detail from this period that explains, better than any argument, why Europe behaved the way it did. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan left Spain with 5 ships and around 270 men, attempting to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west. Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines. 4 of the 5 ships were lost. In 1522, a single ship returned to Spain. The Victoria, 18 survivors, barely able to stand. In her hold was a cargo of cloves, a related spice from islands near Banda. That cargo from 1 ship out of 5 was sufficient to cover the cost of the entire expedition and return a profit to the investors. 4 ships lost, more than 250 men dead. And the voyage still made money. Every European power on the Atlantic coast understood what that meant. Then, in 1602, something new appeared in those waters. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, known as the VOC, was not a trading company in any sense we would recognize today. The Dutch government had granted it the legal power to maintain its own army, build its own fortresses, sign its own treaties with foreign kings, and wage its own wars. It was a corporation with the authority of a state, and it had been created for one purpose: total control of the spice trade. The VOC arrived at Banda and made the same demand the Portuguese had made: exclusive rights. All nutmeg, all mace, sold only to them at a price they would set. The Orankaya did what they had always done. They signed agreements they had no intention of honoring, and they kept selling to whoever else appeared in the bay, and someone else did appear. The English East India Company had been founded 2 years before the Dutch Company, and it was smaller, poorer, and considerably less ruthless. But in 1616, an English captain named Nathaniel Courthope sailed into the Banda group and did something that would echo for the next 50 years. He landed on Run, a single island, roughly 3 kilometers long, little more than a rock covered in nutmeg trees. The people of Run, watching the Dutch tighten their grip across the archipelago, offered Courthope their island, formally in writing, swearing allegiance to the King of England in exchange for protection. Courthope accepted. He dragged cannon up onto the cliffs. He fortified the shoreline, and then he held that island against the most powerful commercial organization on Earth for 4 years. He was never resupplied. He was never reinforced. His men deserted, starved, and died around him, and he refused again and again to surrender. In 1620, Nathaniel Courthope was shot dead in a small boat during a Dutch ambush. His body went into the sea, but the English claim to run did not die with him. It stayed on paper, and a piece of paper, half a century later, would decide the fate of a city on the other side of the world. Up to this point, this has been a story about sailors, secrets, and greed. From here, it becomes something else. The man who arrived in the Banda Islands in 1621 was named Jan Pieterzoon Coen. He was 33 years old, and he was the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. Coen had a theory, and he had written it down clearly in his letters to Amsterdam. He believed the company would never control the spice trade while the people who grew the spices remained free to sell them. Contracts were worthless. Negotiation was weakness. The only reliable monopoly, he argued, was one in which the company owned the land and owned the labor that worked it. In February of 1621, he sailed for Banda with a fleet of ships and roughly 2,000 soldiers, including a unit of Japanese mercenaries, masterless samurai hired by the company for exactly this kind of work. The landings began on Banda Besar, the largest island. The resistance lasted a matter of weeks. The Bandanese fought with what they had, and then they retreated into the interior highlands, and then there was nowhere left to retreat to. Some threw themselves from the cliffs rather than be taken. Coen then summoned the Orang Kaya, the Council of Elders, the men who had negotiated with Europeans for over a century, to a formal meeting inside the Dutch fort. 44 of them came. They were accused of conspiracy. They were condemned without any proceeding that could reasonably be called a trial, and they were executed inside the fort by the Japanese mercenaries in front of the assembled population. A Dutch official who was present wrote afterward that the killings were carried out in a manner so brutal that the soldiers themselves were disturbed by it. He recorded in plain company handwriting that it was a terrible sight to see. What followed over the next months was systematic. The population of the Banda Islands before 1621 is generally estimated at around 15,000 people. Within a year, contemporary Dutch accounts and modern scholarship agree that the number remaining on the islands had collapsed to somewhere around 1,000. The rest were killed in the fighting, or starved in the highlands after their food supplies were destroyed, or deported in ships to Batavia, the company's capital on Java, where they were sold into slavery and where most did not survive the first years. A few hundred escaped to neighboring islands. Their descendants are still there. If you are finding this video interesting, take a second and hit subscribe. We publish a new deep dive like this one every week, and there is a lot more coming. Now, Coen had a problem, and it was an entirely practical one. He had removed the only people on Earth who knew how to cultivate nutmeg. His solution was to redesign the islands from nothing. The land was surveyed and divided into roughly 68 plantation plots called perken. Each plot was granted to a Dutch or Eurasian colonist, a perkeneer, usually a former company soldier or employee. The perkeneers received the land and the trees on one condition. All production would be sold to the company at a price the company set, and to nobody else. And to work those plantations, the company imported enslaved people from Java, from Sulawesi, from India, from wherever the company's network could take them. The islands were repopulated by force with people who had no connection to the place, working trees they had never seen before for owners who answered to a corporation 4,000 kilometers away. It worked exactly as Coen had predicted. For the first time in human history, one organization controlled the entire global supply of a commodity. Not most of it, all of it. Every nutmeg on earth now belonged, at the moment of harvest, to a company registered in Amsterdam. I mean, think about that for a second. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen was not punished. He was criticized in Amsterdam. The company directors found his methods excessive, mainly because the destruction had been expensive. He was reappointed Governor-General a few years later. For centuries afterward, his statue stood in his hometown in the Netherlands, and he was taught to Dutch school children as a founding figure of national greatness. The debate over that statue continues in the Netherlands today. In 1664, England and the Dutch Republic went to war again. The fighting ranged across the North Sea, the Caribbean, the coast of West Africa, and North America. And by 1667, both sides were exhausted, and both sides wanted out. The negotiators met at Breda in the southern Netherlands, and the treaty they produced worked on a simple principle. Each side would keep the territory it currently held and abandon its claims to the rest. The Dutch held Run. The English held a settlement on the North American coast that the Dutch had founded and named New Amsterdam. The English had seized it 3 years earlier and renamed it after the Duke of York. They renamed it New York. So the Treaty of Breda confirmed it. England formally surrendered its claim to Run, 3 kilometers of nutmeg trees. The Dutch Republic formally surrendered its claim to Manhattan. It is often said that the Dutch traded Manhattan for a nutmeg island. That is not quite how it happened. Nobody swapped one for the other across a table. But the substance is exactly right. When the Dutch Republic had to choose which claim to abandon, it let go of the island that would become New York City and kept the nutmeg. And here is the part that is genuinely uncomfortable. At the time, they were right. In 1667, Manhattan was a muddy settlement of a few thousand people at the edge of a continent nobody had mapped. Run produced a spice that traded at a value approaching that of gold, under a monopoly the Dutch now held completely. Any accountant in Amsterdam looking at the numbers in 1667 would have made the same call. Holding that monopoly, however, required a level of effort that verges on the absurd. The company restricted nutmeg cultivation to Banda and clove cultivation to a small number of other islands, and sent armed expeditions on regular patrols to find and destroy any tree growing outside the permitted zones. These voyages had a name. The Dutch called them Hongi expeditions, and they continued for well over a century. Every seed leaving the islands for export was coated in lime, soaked in calcium oxide, which killed the germ inside while leaving the flavor intact. You could buy a nutmeg, you could not grow one. And when the harvest was too large and prices threatened to fall, the company simply destroyed the surplus. There are records of warehouses of nutmeg and mace being burned in Amsterdam, deliberately in public, to keep the price where the company wanted it. That is the answer to the question I left open earlier. That is why a company would burn its own product. Scarcity was not a problem to be solved. Scarcity was the entire business. It held for roughly 150 years, and while it held, nutmeg became something strange in Europe, a status object. Wealthy gentlemen in England and France began carrying pocket nutmeg graters, small silver or ivory cylinders, often beautifully engraved, containing a single nutmeg and a fine rasping blade. You carried your own. You produced it at the table or at an inn, and you grated your own spice into your wine or your punch in front of everybody. It was the 18th century equivalent of setting an expensive watch on the table. And where there is a valuable object that most people cannot examine closely, there is fraud. American peddlers in New England were accused repeatedly of carving nutmegs out of wood and selling them to customers who would not notice until they tried to grate one. Whether this happened as often as the stories claim is genuinely disputed by historians. What is not disputed is that the accusation stuck so firmly that the state of Connecticut is still nicknamed the Nutmeg State. a nickname earned possibly by counterfeiting a seed. What finally broke it was not a war. It was one determined Frenchman and a great deal of patience. Pierre Poivre was a French missionary turned botanist turned colonial administrator, and he spent decades attempting to steal live nutmeg and clove plants out of Dutch territory. His early attempts failed completely. Seedlings died at sea. Local agents cheated him. On one occasion, he obtained plants that turned out to be the wrong species entirely. But in the 1770s, expeditions organized under his direction finally succeeded in carrying living nutmeg plants out of the Moluccas to the French island colonies in the Indian Ocean, to what is now Mauritius and Réunion. The trees survived. They grew, they fruited. The monopoly was finished, and it had taken 150 years and one stubborn botanist to end it. Then, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British occupied the Banda Islands directly. And unlike the Dutch, the British had no interest in preserving scarcity. They had an empire full of tropical colonies and every reason to spread cultivation as widely as possible. They took seedlings out by the thousands, to Penang, to Ceylon, to Bencoolen, to Singapore, and to a small island in the Caribbean called Grenada. The price of nutmeg fell and kept falling. What had been a store of wealth became an ingredient. Within a few generations, a substance men had been killed over could be bought by an ordinary household for the price of a loaf of bread. Today, Indonesia and Grenada together produce the majority of the world's nutmeg. Grenada took to it so completely that the island became known as the Isle of Spice, and the nutmeg was placed on the national flag, where it remains, a small yellow and red seed in the upper left corner of a Caribbean banner. In 2004, Hurricane Ivan crossed directly over Grenada and destroyed roughly 90% of the island's nutmeg trees in a single night. A nutmeg tree takes 7 to 9 years to produce its first useful harvest and does not reach full yield for around 20. The Grenadian nutmeg industry has spent the last 2 decades growing itself back. And that brings us back to the question I left hanging. Medieval Europeans believed nutmeg protected against the plague. They were wrong about the mechanism. Plague is spread by bacteria, carried primarily by fleas on rats, not by bad air. But nutmeg contains a compound called myristicin. And myristicin, along with several other compounds in the seed, has measurable insecticidal properties. It is genuinely unpleasant to insects. There is a hypothesis, not proven and treated cautiously by historians, but persistent, that a wealthy man walking through a plague-stricken city with a container of ground nutmeg held against his face may have been slightly less attractive to fleas than the man beside him. They may have been right by accident, for entirely the wrong reason, which is, in fairness, how a surprising amount of medicine worked for most of human history. Myristicin has another property, and it is worth mentioning only as a warning. In large quantities, nutmeg is toxic to humans. It causes severe nausea, dangerously irregular heartbeat, disorientation and hallucination lasting many hours, and it can require hospitalization. Cases turn up in emergency rooms every year. It is not a pleasant experience, and it is not a safe one. So, a jar of ground nutmeg in a supermarket today costs a few units of whatever currency you happen to use. It sits on a shelf next to the cinnamon, beneath fluorescent light, and almost nobody picks it up. Meanwhile, the Banda Islands remain among the most remote inhabited places in Indonesia. Reaching them requires a flight, a boat, and patience. The Dutch fort still stands above the harbour on Banda Nera, restored, quiet, visited by a small number of travellers each year. The nutmeg trees still grow on the slopes below it, tended by the descendants of the people who were brought there in chains to replace the people who were killed. The islands produce nutmeg still. They are not wealthy. It was worth more than gold. It was worth more than land. It was worth more than a city that would become New York. And it was worth, in the calculation of the men who ran that trade, considerably more than the lives of every single person who lived on the islands where it grew. 15,000 people lived on the Banda Islands in the spring of 1621. By the following year, fewer than 1,000 remained. The trees are still there. The fort is still there. The company that ordered it went bankrupt in 1799 and no longer exists. And the thing they did all of it for is sitting in your kitchen cupboard right now, unopened since last winter, worth almost nothing at all. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe. We publish a new deep dive into the hidden history of everyday food every week. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this you did not know, because I suspect it is the Manhattan part. And give the video a like so that more people find it. Thank you for watching.